The Subcommittee on National Security will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Since the first detainees arrived in 2002, the United States' detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, has housed a total of 779 detainees. There are currently 80 detainees remaining in Guantanamo Bay. The remaining detainee population is generally composed of hardened and unrepented terrorists. The transfer of any of these detainees from Guantanamo Bay to another country risks harming America's national security. While we cannot be certain that a particular detainee will return to terrorism, we can say that the chance of recidivism with these particular detainees is high. According to the most recent statistics from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, 204 out of the 676 released detainees are either confirmed to have re-engaged or are suspected of re-engaging in terrorist activities. Many of these detainees were thought to no longer represent a threat when they were released, yet they nevertheless returned to terrorism. The Obama administration has acknowledged that Americans have been killed at the hands of detainees who had previously been released from Gitmo. When President Obama took office, he inherited a largely high-risk population of 240 detainees. One of the President's first actions in office was to issue an executive order calling for the closure of the detention facilities at Guantanamo Bay. The administration failed to secure congressional support for closing Gitmo, so it has attempted to empty out the facility by transferring detainees that they had previously deemed too dangerous to transfer. Once a detainee is earmarked for transfer, an interagency team works with potential receiving countries to negotiate security and humanitarian assurances regarding the detainee. These agreements, though, are classified. It has not been made clear whether the administration is tracking compliance with these agreements or has just allowed risks to mount. The administration has recently approved transfers of detainees to countries with no track record of receiving detainees and with limited intelligence capabilities, including Ghana and Senegal. The administration, no doubt, is ideologically committed to closing Guantanamo Bay. The President's conclusion that the detention facility should be closed is based in part on his idea that the facility is a recruiting tool for Islamic jihadists. But this represents a misunderstanding of the nature of the terrorist threats we face. Just last week in Mosul, radical Islamic terrorists lowered 25 suspected spies into acid. They were dissolved alive. These are not the type of people that will abandon their jihad against America and our allies simply because we close Guantanamo Bay. In fact, in the most recent issue of al-Qaeda's propaganda machine, the jihadi author argued that the President's plan to close Gitmo would have little effect on recruitment efforts. It has been used as a pretext at times to recruit, but it's not the underlying cause of terrorist activity. The only way America can stop radical Islamic terrorism is to defeat radical Islamic terrorism. Appeasing terrorists or worrying about their feelings simply will not work. The administration's effort to close Guantanamo are not aimed at securing the United States' national security interests, but instead at ideological victory. Today we'll hear from a panel of experts who are able to discuss the dangers inherent in transferring the remaining detainees. They will also be able to speak to problems with past transfers and to elaborate on why the administration continues to repeat some of the mistakes of the past. I thank each of them for joining us today, and I also would like to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing to examine the national security issues related to the detention facility at the U.S. Naval Station at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I'd also like to thank today's witnesses for helping this subcommittee with its work. As reported by the Department of Defense, nearly 800 detainees have been held at Guantanamo since 2002, including a peak of 684 detainees in June of 2003. Over the past 13 years, the detainee population has been dramatically reduced by about 85%, or 691 inmates, with more than 530 detainees transferred by President Bush and 158 transferred by President Obama to the custody of an estimated 60 different countries. During my last visit to Guantanamo a couple of years ago, we went out to Camp 7, where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others are imprisoned. The number of detainees stood at about 174, but today there are only 80. In accordance with the Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2016, the Defense Department submitted a plan to Congress to resolve the disposition of these remaining detainees and implement the President's intent to close the facility as a national security imperative. It provides that the Administration will review detainee eligibility for secure transfer to foreign government custody or prosecution by a U.S. military commission. For detainees who must be subject to continued detention, the plan proposes relocation to an appropriate detention facility within the continental United States. As such, this plan will require explicit congressional approval. In support of its plan, the Defense Department reports that the cost of operating the detention mission at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in fiscal year 2015 was about $445 million. It also estimates that closure would lower annual operational costs by about $140 million and $180 million. I would note that the annual cost of operating Gitmo follows the significant infrastructure investment that we've already made in the facility. Very, very nice court and very nice facilities there, including a $12 million for the courtroom known as the Expeditionary Legal Complex. I'm not sure we've used that yet, though. Wish I had a court like that in my district, to be honest with you. Now, much of the political and legislative debate over Guantanamo continues to focus on the very broad question of whether closing the facility would serve our national interest. That's the question that we're trying to answer today. The annual Defense Authorization Bill again includes provisions designed to prohibit closure. Now, I totally understand that, but I also think that Defense Department and our wider responsibility should have the flexibility to figure out what we're going to do with these folks under the rule of law. And if it's prosecution, we got to prosecute them. And we need to reach a determination of that, because I think a country that relies on the rule of law and is widely respected for our implementation under the rule of law, this is sort of a backwater. It's an area where the rule of law has not definitely been applied here. We're sort of in limbo, so we got to figure out what to do. National security demands dictate that we do not simply remain at a political impasse over the closure. Rather, it is imperative that we work on a bipartisan basis to examine the threshold issue of whether each detainee poses a threat not only to national security of the United States, but also that of our coalition partners in the global campaign to counter the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations. In addition, we must assess whether we can securely transfer eligible detainees to foreign custody and mitigate their potential to return as militants to the battlefield of Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, or conduct terrorist operations worldwide. As reported by the Director of the National Intelligence in March of this year, approximately 17.5% of former Gitmo detainees that have been transferred to other countries are confirmed of re-engaging in terrorist or insurgent activities. That's 118 out of 676 former detainees who are directly involved in terrorism or insurgency since the first Guantanamo transfers in 2002. This includes 111 detainees transferred during the Bush administration and 7 detainees transferred during the Obama administration. An estimated 12.7% of former Guantanamo detainees, 86 altogether, are suspected of re-engaging in terrorist or insurgent activities. In order to strengthen the detainee vetting process, the President established an interagency board in 2009 to evaluate detainees on a rolling basis and determine their eligibility for transfer to a third country, prosecution, or continued detention. This is a marked improvement over previous vetting conducted by a single agency, the Department of Defense. However, continued evidence of terrorist re-engagement reiterates that we must further enhance our detainee review process to assure that custody is handled in a secure and responsible manner. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to examining these other issues with our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. I'd also ask unanimous consent to introduce for the record a hot-off-the-presses article about 24 more Gitmo detainees poised for release without objection. So ordered. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Tom Jocelyn, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Commander Kurt Leopold, U.S. Navy retired former commanding officer of the USS Cole, Mr. J. Allen Leota, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Detainee Affairs at the U.S. Department of Defense, and Mr. Alberto Mora, Senior Fellow at the Carr Center of Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and former General Counsel of the United States Navy. Mr. Mora will be testifying in his personal capacity. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. If you can please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you'll give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? All witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, please limit your remarks to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. And with that, Mr. Jocelyn, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and other members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. This is the 14th time I've testified before Congress. The only other hearing that was highly contentious that I testified at was dealing with Guantanamo. So it is obviously a hot issue. But I'd like to take a step back and look more in terms of just the facts of who's remaining at Guantanamo within the four walls of the Obama administration's own documents. So this is based on what the Obama administration itself has said about the remaining detainee population. And I'm going to do that very quickly through the lens of thinking about Guantanamo as a risk management problem. Because for years now, U.S. officials have been transferring detainees. And there's an idea, and this goes before the Obama administration, where a number of high-risk detainees during the Bush years were also transferred. And it's not that they were thought to be basically riskless or that they pose no recidivism threat. It's that there are subjective judgments that are made about the ability to mitigate the threat that detainees pose. And this is a very tricky process, and I sympathize with officials in the U.S. government who are going through this because I don't think that it's easy at all. But when we go through this very quickly, you see that the majority of the detainees who are left have been identified by the Obama administration itself as in that high-risk population. And so in 2009, President Obama's task force began reviewing the detainee population and looked through 240 detainees. 156 of them were approved for transfer in one way or another. Now, as the task force made clear, approved for transfer did not mean that they were deemed innocent, nor did it mean that they thought that there was no risk of recidivism. But they thought they could be safely transferred subject to appropriate security measures. In practice, I think it's difficult for some nations to put in place those appropriate security measures. Today, we have 80 detainees left, as both of you congressmen have noted. Of those 80, 65 were deemed by President Obama's task force to be too dangerous to transfer. So we've gotten, basically the administration has transferred all but 15 of the detainees who originally said that they could transfer. You're down to 65 of the 80 are now either were slated for continued detention on the laws of war, meaning the authorization of use of military force in 2001, or referred for prosecution. So that's 65 of the 80. Then on top of that, we have 11 Yemeni detainees who were placed in conditional detention and 4 who were approved for transfer. Now, that's the current state of the population. That means that over 80% of the population was deemed by Obama's task force to be in this do not transfer, sort of one of two do not transfer categories. Subsequently, the Obama administration set up this periodic review board process. This is looking at only the detainees, so far as I can tell, who were placed in continued detention or referred for prosecution. And based on publicly available documents on the Periodic Review Board's website, 29 decisions or 29 detainees have had a decision in their case so far. 22 of them have ultimately been approved for transfer. So these are 29 detainees who, under the Obama's task force, were deemed too dangerous to transfer. Now the Periodic Review Board has reviewed them, and in 22 cases, they've actually been approved for transfer. In some of these cases on the Periodic Review Board itself determined at one point that these detainees were too dangerous to transfer and then subsequently approved them for transfer anyway. So, for example, in 2014, a detainee named Fayez Al-Kandari was initially denied his transfer and then later in the year was approved his transfer. And in the initial decision, the Periodic Review Board said that they thought he was had an extremist mindset and basically couldn't be rehabilitated, and they didn't trust Kuwait to take him in. By the end of the year, they said that they thought he was willing to reconsider somewhat and that Kuwait could be trusted to take him in. All of this underscores a very simple fact as far as I'm concerned. And because there's some reporting in the press, I think it's worth clarifying this here today. You'll see that detainees, you'll see the phrase cleared for release in press coverage. Cleared for release, as far as I can tell, that phrase is never used by the periodic review boards. was never used by Obama's task force, was not used in any of these proceedings as far as I can tell. The phrase they use different versions of is approved for transfer, which means that in their minds, security measures need to be put in place in order to transfer these detainees safely. Finally, just recently, the Periodic Review Board actually ruled in favor of a detainee named Obodula, I gave you the spelling there, whose ISN number is 762. He was somebody who was referred for prosecution originally by Obama's task force, but then on May 19th, a Periodic Review Board ruled that he could be transferred, basically because he and his family said that he could be reintegrated into society. We're at a point now where I think that detainees who were referred for prosecution by a task force, as you said, Congressman Lynch, they should be tried if they were referred for prosecution. We don't have a system in place right now because the military commission system has been ground to a halt, and there's an unwillingness to use the federal courts to do this, to try them. But in my mind, there are dangerous detainees who should be tried and can be tried, and that would keep them from going back to the battlefield for sure. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. The Chair now recognizes Commander Leopold for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lynch, my name is Commander Kirk Leopold, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. In my 26 years in the Navy, I was a surface warfare officer serving on 5 different ships, including guided missile cruisers and destroyers, to protect U.S. national security interests across the globe. I have experienced firsthand, particularly in my command of USS Cole when it was attacked by al-Qaeda terrorists, the devastating effects of terrorism. In that attack, the United States had failed to realize we were in an undeclared state of war with al-Qaeda. Unfortunately, it took the 9/11 attacks 11 months later to finally put the Department of Defense on a war footing. That war effort continues today, and rather than abating and slowing, it is picking up in pace and in lethality on an unprecedented scale. Following my command of USS Cole, I was assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Directorate for Strategic Plans and Policy. My office was tasked to develop the policies on how the U.S. military would conduct post-9/11 detainee operations. Today, the failure to use Guantanamo Bay has made the U.S. less safe and more vulnerable since we no longer have a facility with its unique capabilities to leverage the intelligence advantage that our nation could possess with its use. Keeping Guantanamo Bay open is more important now than ever before in the war effort. Guantanamo Bay was chosen as the best place for long-term detention for a host of legal, operational, and logistics reasons that there is much more valuable strategic consideration. It was designed to be an intelligence center for excellence in the war on terror. If the U.S. can get terrorists off the battlefield and into Guantanamo Bay, we can be presented with an unprecedented opportunity to gain a comprehensive understanding of how al-Qaeda recruits, trains, equips, finances, and conducts these operations. Once we understand how they do that, then and only then can we truly target them for defeat. Today, many people demand that the detention facility be closed, and some of the more socially popular reasons include it's a recruiting tool, it's too costly, it's a human rights embarrassment, the detainees have a right to a trial. All these reasons are specious and fail to hold up to the facts when people take time to understand the true nature of the facility. Guantanamo Bay must become the crown jewel for the United States in the intelligence effort to defeat transnational terrorist groups. It is not a recruiting tool. Correlation is not causation. Just because Gitmo is cited in terrorist literature and propaganda, it does not prove it is why recruits join terrorist organizations any more than the movie spurred the Benghazi attacks. No accurate cost calculations exist to justify closing Guantanamo Bay. While everyone focuses on the facility to house them, all the second and third order effects on the local communities, not to mention the constitutional issues, have ever been addressed. The U.S. Navy got out of the prison ship business in the 1700s. Let's not give that sad period in our history new life. Taking a naval warship worth an estimated $2 billion, sending it on a short disruptive deployment to serve as a logistics platform and prison ship is a waste of a strategic asset when the nation already has a state-of-the-art facility that could serve the same purpose, Guantanamo Bay. As stipulated under the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict, the U.S. has a right under international law to detain combatants captured on the battlefield till the end of the conflict. Al-Qaeda and Taliban started this war, not the United States, and they continue to wage that war on us today. Also, under the law of armed conflict and the conventions, there is no requirement for a trial or legal proceeding to assess the guilt or innocence of unlawful enemy combatants engaged in an armed conflict against the United States. The only requirement is a periodic review, which the U.S. still does, to confirm the circumstances of their capture. Still unclassified productions estimate that about 30% of the detainees released from Guantanamo Bay have returned to the fight in one form or another. Classified estimates put that number even higher. While it's been almost 15 years since 9/11, the United States is still a nation at war. No detainee that is confirmed to be an unlawful enemy combatant who is engaged in armed conflict against the United States should be released from our custody. They should be held in indefinite detention under the law of armed conflict, or if they meet the criteria for a trial by military commission, charge them, try them, convict them for their crimes, and hold them accountable. In conclusion, the United States government has a moral responsibility to the American people and the world to ensure that not one more American or any citizen from any nation dies at the hands of a terrorist released from Guantanamo Bay. Keeping the detention facility open is in the best interest of the United States and the American people. The threat of ongoing terrorist operations against the United States militates that as a nation, we should continue using the facilities that have already been built there and expand their use to ensure that another terrorist attack is not carried out against the United States.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Leota for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the committee, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. From February 2004 until January 2015, when I retired after more than 32 years of government service, I served as the ranking career civilian officer overseeing the Office of Detainee Affairs and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I was there when Secretary Rumsfeld created the office in the aftermath of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. I am proud to say that over the subsequent 11 years, I helped play an instrumental role working with 7 different Deputy Assistant Secretaries of Defense during both the Bush and Obama administrations to create a sound, credible, and transparent detention policy that now many countries across the globe seek to emulate. Today, I am retired from government service and do not represent the views of the Department of Defense. My statements here today are solely my own personal views. With this in mind, I would like to focus on the processes used to review the threat those in detention still pose and whether our government should continue to negotiate the transfer of those whose potential threat can be mitigated safely by other countries. Secretary Rumsfeld made it clear during his tenure that while we would detain those who sought to harm our national interests, we were not, nor should we be, the world's jailer. During his stewardship of the Department and that of every subsequent Secretary of Defense, the Department sought to ensure a process to review the continuing level of threat posed by each detainee. During the Bush administration, DoD relied on the Administrative Review Board process, chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, to review all of the available information that DoD's hands on each detainee to assess their level of threat. If a detainee was determined to no longer be a threat, he was released. And during the first ARB process, 14 detainees were approved for release with no restrictions against them. More often, the Deputy Secretary used the ARB process to approve the transfer of individuals who were believed to continue to represent some level of threat, but a level that could be constrained through negotiated security assurances with the receiving country. These assurances included the restriction of movement from within or outside of the country, a continued monitoring of the individual, and where applicable, prosecution under local laws. During the Bush administration, 214 detainees were transferred with such restrictions during the ARB process. When President Obama assumed office in 2009, he ordered the Justice Department to spearhead an executive review of all information available on each detainee. This review assessed all of the information available to the ARBs, as well as a considerable amount of highly classified intelligence that had not been part of the ARB review. As a result, the Executive Task Force determined that 126 detainees were approved for transfer subject to appropriate security assurances, 44 were referred for review as prosecution candidates, 30 Yemeni detainees were approved for conditional detention, meaning that they could be transferred if the security situation in Yemen improved or an appropriate rehabilitation or third country resettlement option became available, and 48 detainees were approved for continued detention. Following the task force review, there began an aggressive move to transfer the 126 detainees recommended for transfer. Between 2010 and 2013, I worked successfully with Ambassador Dan Fried from the State Department to transfer 87 detainees to 29 countries and to the U.S. for federal prosecution. Although we continue to explore efforts made during the Bush administration to provide a safer security environment in Yemen, the attempt by a terrorist to bring down an airplane bound for Detroit resulted in President Obama's announcement of a moratorium on any transfers to Yemen. In October 2013, in an effort to accelerate transfers, President Obama instructed the Defense and State Departments to appoint special envoys exclusively dedicated to the mission of transferring detainees. Since both DoD and the state envoys have been in place, 84 detainees have been transferred with security assurances to 20 countries. By this time, however, it was clear that the information used by the task force in 2009 to assess the potential threat of a detainee eligible for transfer was increasingly stale. So in November 2013, the Defense Department conducted the first periodic review board hearing to determine whether a detainee previously determined as not eligible for transfer was still a significant threat against the United States and its allies. Like the Executive Order Task Force, the PRB consisted of 6 voting members, one each from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Departments of State, Homeland Security, Justice, and from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Although the PRBs are a military administrative procedure and not a judicial or a penal process, the detainees can opt to be represented by both military representatives and legal counsel. In addition, the detainee is afforded the opportunity to address the board and directly answer their questions, which makes the process more like a parole board review in the American penal system. Since the first PRB, there have been 43 hearings for 39 detainees. Of these 43 hearings, 11 detainees were determined to remain in continued detention, 21 had their status changed to transfer, and 11 decisions are still pending. Of those whose status was changed to transfer, 9 have since been transferred with security assurances, and the remaining 12 are at Gitmo. Finally, allow me to address the issue of detainees who return to the fight since their transfer from Gitmo. The intelligence community assessed in its most recent unclassified report that 204 of the 606 former Guantanamo detainees are suspected or confirmed to have returned to the fight. This represents about 30% of the detainees transferred. Moreover, the intelligence community notes that transfers to countries with ongoing conflicts and internal stability, as well as recruitment by insurgent and terrorist organizations, poses problems with transfers. No one wants to see a detainee who is transferred return to the fight. The Congress has sought through varying degrees of legislation to try and to prevent detainees from re-engaging once transferred, but the reality is the only way to prevent detainees to return to the fight is to never transfer them from Gitmo. But as the PRBs continue to show, that simply is not a feasible option for many of the detainees who indeed no longer wish to pursue terrorist objectives. And as Secretary Rumsfeld once warned, it would turn us into the world's jailers. Thank you very much for my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Mora for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for inviting me here today to participate in this important hearing. I will focus my brief comments on the impact that the closure of Guantanamo would have on the United States' national security interests. In my capacity as Navy General Counsel in the years after 9/11, I was deeply involved in the legal and policy issues related to the detention, interrogation, and status review of detainees held at Guantanamo. Based on my experience and judgment, I believe that closing Guantanamo would significantly enhance U.S. national security. And there are many others who share this view. In addition to Presidents Bush and Obama, 5 former and current Secretaries of Defense and 5 chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have supported closing Guantanamo, as have 7 former Secretaries of State across both Republican and Democratic administrations. Earlier this year, 36 retired generals and admirals, including General Charles Krulak, the former Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Major General Michael Leonard, the commander in charge of setting up the detention facility, wrote to Congress urging that it help close Guantanamo. These are the 5 reasons to close Guantanamo. First, because there's no longer any unique legal reason to use the facility. As we know, Guantanamo is no longer outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. federal courts, and this was the principal reason for its selection in the first place. Thus, there is no longer any significant legal advantage to holding detainees in Guantanamo as opposed to holding them in federal detention facilities in the United States. Second, because Guantanamo simply costs too much. Guantanamo costs the U.S. taxpayer $445 million a year, or about $5.56 million per detainee annually, compared to federal facilities that incarcerate prisoners at a maximum cost of about $78,000 per prisoner per year. This is waste in its purest form. Third, because Guantanamo requires and constitutes a wasteful use of scarce military personnel. Currently, there are approximately 1,200 soldiers guarding a mere 80 detainees in Guantanamo. Given that this function could easily be civilianized, this represents a highly wasteful use of scarce military personnel. Fourth, because Guantanamo does not provide any unique security function that is not already being provided by the federal prison system. Stateside detention facilities are currently holding at least 443 convicted terrorists in facilities located across 21 U.S. states, including a number of high-level al-Qaeda plotters and even one former Guantanamo detainee. There is no evidence that holding these men within the United States has presented any danger to local communities. There is evidence, however, that Guantanamo is therefore not uniquely secure. And fifth and most important, because the foreign policy and national security costs of maintaining Guantanamo as a detention facility are too high and outweigh the benefit that it provides. Fairly or unfairly, Guantanamo is today regarded by millions around the world as a symbol of American injustice and cruelty. Because of this, Guantanamo has contributed to a loss of American lives overseas. Let me explain how. A recently discovered 2006 U.S. diplomatic cable from our embassy in Kuwait reported on a meeting of senior U.S. military, intelligence, and diplomatic officials to review our counterterrorism strategy in Iraq, including the causes for terrorist inflows in theory. I should mention that General Sally McChrystal was present and participated in that meeting. The cable states, and I quote, "The primary motivator for most terrorists and foreign fighters, as reported by U.S. military intelligence, remains perceived U.S. abuses of and lack of due process for detainees at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, making this issue a key driver of terrorist and foreign fighters flows and a key element undermining international confidence in the United States' ability to conduct an effective war on terrorism that remains true to American values." Although that cable was written in 2006, in 2013, the Director of National Intelligence stated that Guantanamo continues to serve as a propaganda tool in service of al-Qaeda's false narratives and justifications for waging a global jihad against the United States. By continuing to serve as a symbol of American injustice, Guantanamo contributes to anti-Americanism, diminishes public support for U.S. policies in allied nations, contributes to and continues to be used by dictators and repressive regimes to justify their own abusive detention policies. In concluding, Guantanamo is too expensive, too inefficient, and too wasteful of scarce military resources. It provides no additional security to what is routinely provided every single day by federal prisons in the United States to terrorists as dangerous as any in Guantanamo. And critically, it provides ammunition to America's enemies to mischaracterize our values, our policies, and our objectives in the war on terror. Mr. Chairman, Guantanamo is not an asset, it's a liability. I thank the committee again and look forward to answering your questions.
Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Commander, what role did Gitmo, the facility at Gitmo, play in sparking the terrorists to attack the USS Cole?
The facility did not exist back then. It played no role.
And the facility also did not exist in the embassy bombings in '98, correct?
It didn't exist for the embassy bombings.
Or the
It did not exist
WTC in
for-
'93, and of course, it did not exist for the 9/11 2001 attacks, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Now, the administration recently released Mashar Abdallah Muqbil Ahmed al-Sabri, who is connected to the Cole bombing. Do you think that that release was in the national security interests of our country?
Absolutely not. One of the biggest problems with that release is that he was being held under the law of armed conflict. There was not enough evidence, but he was directly tied to the attack on USS Cole and was nonetheless released because the bar was lowered yet again to allow another detainee to go free.
Now, have you spoken to any of the families of those who had family members killed or injured in the Cole bombing about this?
I stay in touch with them constantly, and they were devastated to know that a person who is connected to the attack on USS Cole that killed 17 sailors, including their loved ones and their friends, as far as my crew is concerned, was being released by the Obama administration. They felt it was unfair, and it blindsided them, despite the President's promise at a meeting on February 6, 2009, where he said he would keep the families informed as to what he was going to do with the facility and the detainees, and he has failed to live up to that promise.
So there was no consultation at all?
Zero.
Now, do you believe it's likely that he will reengage in terrorism, al-Sabri?
I think there's a good chance. It certainly proves that he can do it. And while he does have family, and he was Yemen background but transferred to Saudi Arabia, there is a possibility he will return. We are hoping that the family will keep him stable. But again, it is the influence that goes on. It is no different than the recidivism rate. much, much higher than you see with prisons. It's who you associate with. There are still people in Saudi Arabia who have conformed to the Wahhabi lifestyle, who believe in that form. They believe in jihad, and if he falls into that environment, again, I believe he will return to the battlefield.
Yeah, that's, Mr. Moore, I don't, putting detainees into American prisons, wouldn't that run the risk of American prisoners being radicalized?
Mr. Chairman, we already have 443 terrorists in American prisons. I think adding a few more is not going to appreciably change the risk.
So you don't think it will add to the risk at all?
I think only marginally.
Well, I think there's a problem with radical Islam in some of these prisons. I don't want to be adding to it. Let me ask you, Mr. Jocelyn, the estimate from National Intelligence was 30% of transferred detainees are either suspected or have been confirmed of reengaging in terrorism. Do you quibble with those numbers?
The reason I would quibble with it a little bit is I don't use the re-engagement percentage. And the reason is because it basically, there's a lot of unknown in the denominator. So it's basically the confirmed and suspected recidivists are the numerator. That assumes that the denominator is everybody who's been transferred, but yet there are people who've been transferred where we don't know what they're doing.
Exactly. Now, DOD has admitted that Americans have died because of released detainees. Do you know how many Americans have died as a result of detainees being released from Gitmo?
Congressman, I don't know the precise number. I know only anecdotal evidence that actually I testified previously about a former Gitmo detainee named Mullah Zukir, who became the Taliban's top military commander. He was transferred by the Bush administration to Afghanistan, who promptly released him. We have firm evidence, and there's firm reporting that he and his men systematically hunted down U.S. Marines in Afghanistan, and he led the opposition to President Obama's surge in Afghanistan. This was a uniquely lethal individual, and it's actually guys like him that I'm most worried about being transferred today.
And can you discuss the current detainee population, who specifically are very high risk and that would represent a danger to our national security if released?
Well, we have, obviously you have the 9/11 plotters, or a few of them, and some other guys who were involved in these anti-Western plots. Very quickly, I hope that those guys won't be transferred. Those are the clearest cases. My concern is that there's a layer underneath them, guys like I mentioned previously in my testimony, who are, as far as our assessments go, pretty committed ideologues and who can do damage themselves.
Great. I think that what we're trying to figure out, we know the administration has acknowledged that Americans have been killed as a result of some of these detainees who have been released. I wish the conflict was over, because then we just figure out. But not only is the conflict not over, to me, the Islamists are on the march. If you look at what they're doing in the Middle East, if you look at what they're doing in North Africa, if you look at what they're doing in Europe now with different cells, this is a problem that I think is more acute than it was even before 9/11. And I think putting these guys back into circulation, I think it's bad for the security, but it's also it's a morale killer if you have somebody who was involved with the Cole go back to terrorism. You're just like, geez, what are we doing? Well, my time is up. I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just to be clear, of the six, there were originally, at the peak, there were about 686 detainees. But by the time President Obama took office, looks like 440 of them had already been released. Is that correct, Mr. Jocelyn?
779 detainees, as far as I'm aware, have been held there one time or another. By January 2009, the population was down to 240.
Okay. So more than 400 were released by President Bush. Any indication of any of these folks that were released by President Bush killing Americans?
I would say the majority, overwhelming majority of known and suspected recidivists at this point come from the Bush administration transfers and releases. Some of these guys included leaders in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has, of course, targeted the U.S. I don't think they've actually killed the U.S., but that doesn't mean the threat, or Americans, but that doesn't mean the threat to the U.S. isn't there. And, of course, Mullah Zukir was somebody who was transferred during the Bush years and did come back to haunt us. Okay.
Mr. Mora, thank you. And thank you all for your testimony. I really appreciate you coming forward here. Ironically, I've been to Gitmo. I've actually gone into the cells and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I've been through that facility. As I said in my opening statement, I wish that some of my prisons in the United States were as nice as what we got going on there at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Even though people, now, if you're wrongly detained, I don't care how nice the jail is, it's still a jail and you're wrongly in prison. But I mean, some of these cells, they're a lot bigger. I know in Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's case, he's got a front room and then he's got a back room with a screen on the back to the outdoors, where actually there's actually sun that enters into the back of his cell. It's got a pretty nice arrangement there. Got an arrow on the floor that points towards Mecca so we can pray. Got, you know, videos and all that stuff. So, and yet you got this perception out there of American injustice for us, the way we're treating these detainees in Guantanamo. You know, I go to the prisons in my district, and they're very harsh compared to what the inmates and detainees are looking at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And then I visit the prisons. I've gone into the prisons in Iraq, and you want to talk about grim. It just defies reality that people think, you know, that this is a recruiting tool for, I know that what the perceived injustice is, but the reality of the conditions, the way we're treating our prisoners, our detainees, compared to the way a lot of those folks are being treated in places like Yemen, like Iraq, some places in Egypt. You hear a lot of that among former prisoners in prisons in those countries. It defies. I think the perception is very far from reality in terms of you know what we're doing and what we're trying to do, as opposed to what people are condemning us for. Is there, Mr. Liotta, you mentioned that in your job you help reassign, I think you said, inmates to detainees to 29 different countries. Yeah, okay. And I notice in overall of all these, we've reassigned detainees to 60 different countries. Are any of the countries that you've been involved with in reassigning detainees to, are any of them reliable, let's say, in terms of taking custody of these detainees, keeping them in secure environments, not letting them get back to the battlefield? Are any of the countries that we've reassigned to, have they been reliable partners in terms of, you know, securing these people, not abusing them, but keeping them in prison and keeping these people off the battlefield? Any of these countries at all?
Yes, sir. And to be clear, all of the transfers that I was involved in involved transfers with security assurances that the country would display and we could assess their capability and their willingness, which is different than capability, to prevent the detainee from re-engaging in the fight. And my job was to go and negotiate with these countries and then come back and talk to report to the Deputy Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of Defense and explain to them what those capabilities and those willingnesses were, and was the country able to do that. And
would you give any of these countries high marks, and would you give any of them low marks, failing grades?
It runs the entire spectrum, you're right.
Do you want to name any of the countries that have done a good job?
Well, I think from my personal perspective, I think a country that's done a very good job is Saudi Arabia. They have an aggressive program that's designed to de-radicalize not only Guantanamo detainees that are returned to Saudi Arabia, but also their own citizens in domestic jihad that use attacks. They are under assault every day by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they have an aggressive effort to try to make sure that they can de-radicalize, or if they can't de-radicalize, that they can imprison and keep from the battlefield detainees that would cause harm to them or to us or to our allies.
Let me just ask you the opposite side of the coin. Anybody that you would not recommend us, you know, relocating or redeploying some of these detainees? Anybody any country have you seen, through your experience, immediately release people and let them go back to the battlefield?
I would not make recommendations to the Secretary or the Deputy Secretary if I felt that there was a possibility that that was going to happen, that a country would not live up to its expectations.
No, I'm not saying anybody you reassign, but from your experience of seeing detainees sent to a foreign country and then having them go to the battlefield, are there any countries that you think are, you know, too permissive in releasing those people who are committed to foreign custody?
Ranking Member Lynch, I'd have to think about that. I can't say off the top of my
Okay,
head.
that's fair enough. No, all right. I'm over my time. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired, but I appreciate your point about, you know, going to Gitmo. When I was in the Navy, I was there for a time, and It's a very professionally run facility. Anybody in this room would rather spend a night there than in like the Fallujah jail or something like this. I mean, it is just night and day, and the people that are guarding that facility are under an awful lot of pressure because those detainees are very hostile to them, and they know that if they do anything, that they're going to all of a sudden be subject to investigation. So it's a very stressful environment for our uniformed personnel who are there. Chair now recognizes Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you want to go first? You can go first if you want to.
Okay, Chair now recognizes Mr. Micah for 5 minutes.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Mr. Mora, you testified that Guantanamo, or at least our policy there, constitute cruelty?
No, sir, it's perceived as having been a place where cruelty was
Were you
applied to
aware
some
of
the detainees.
cruelty taking place there?
Not now, sir.
And you've been there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I was there, and the chairman also mentioned, where would you rather spend a night? I saw the treatment of the detainees, and I can assure you that my veterans, my seniors, many of my people who worked very hard, none of those folks had the I have many of them in my district who do not have the accommodations, the medical care, the recreational facilities that we are affording those individuals. I saw no cruelty there. In fact, the press asked me what I thought when I left, and I think it's a quote my kids put on the refrigerator. Their dad said it. My response was, "It's too good for the bastards." And I believe that. Now, you also talked about due process. Okay. Commander Lippold, I guess we lost 3,000, around 3,000 people, various nationalities, in 9/11. Are you aware of due process that was extended to those individuals who were mass murdered, sir?
No, sir.
And then troops killed in Afghanistan, I have 2,172. Some of those detainees killed and slaughtered our troops. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And were they extended due process, any of the troops, before they slaughtered them?
Well, a due process proceeding actually does not apply when you're engaged in law of armed
Right.
conflict, but they were not engaged in a manner where they
And these
deserved
were-
Geneva
these-
Convention protections.
These were not part of any sovereign state. They are enemy combatants without a country, not having normal status under the law. Mr. Morris said there's no legal reason for their detention, that we could, he questioned the basis on which we're detaining these people. Do you agree with that?
I do not. We have a right under international law and the Geneva Convention to detain these combatants for the duration of the conflict.
And let's see, you mentioned the 17 soldiers on the SS Cole. They were all given due process before they were slaughtered too, weren't they?
No.
Okay. Well, again, I'm very concerned about what's been said here today. And then the number of detainees that have been released. I guess the non-classified is about 30% have returned, over 200, to re-slaughter Americans, re-slaughter innocent people. Is that, Mr. Jocelyn, Mr. Lippold, is that an accurate assessment?
It's accurate. 204 confirmed and suspected recidivists.
So even if we let the percentage Mr. Moore wants to, again, relocate, we risk the possibility, or if they release them, these are the hardest core of the hardest core killers that I guess an independent panel has said these are the baddest of the bad. Is that correct?
I don't think there's any dispute over the majority of the detainees that are left, how much of a risk they pose.
And one of my concerns is for both the Bush and the Obama administrations is we have released people when we are in a state of war that should have been detained because they posed a risk. And once we detected there was a recidivism rate at all, any transfers out of Guantanamo Bay at that point should have stopped. While Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld may have said we don't want to be the world's jailer, that's putting it in a legal context like it's some criminal action backed by 100,000 military. It's not. We're at
There's
war.
some places, I think I helped get somebody, maybe it was the Khobar Tower murderers, back to Saudi Arabia. I thought it was fitting to get them back there because they behead them, and I thought that that was adequate due process for those that slaughtered one of the high school students who I spoke at his graduation, and then I spoke at his funeral. He was slaughtered, and I stood with another member of Congress at Khobar Towers, and I'll never forget walking through there, seeing the images of our soldiers. Their bodies had been blasted against the wall, the bloody imprint was there, and then walking down the hallways, as I saw the blood trail of people trying to get out of the building, our soldiers who they slaughtered, they didn't have due process. Sorry, Mr. Moore, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Seeing nobody on the Democratic side, the chair will now recognize Mr. Duncan for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to read a 1-minute speech that I gave on the floor on November 20th of 2013, 2.5 years ago. Yesterday, the Washington Times reported that the U.S. is now spending millions on life skills and art seminars for prisoners at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. The paper said a multi-million-dollar federal contract is teaching Gitmo detainees basic landscaping, calligraphy, and Microsoft PowerPoint, among other seminars, in addition to library services and special food, and Mr. Micah mentioned recreation facilities. Last July, the Comptroller of the Defense Department reported that the cost of keeping Guantanamo prison open during 2013 would be an astounding $454 million for just 164 prisoners. This comes out to roughly $2.7 million per year for each one of these detainees held in the prison camp. This compares to $72,000 per year per prisoner in federal high-security prisons, supermax prisons, and $34,000 in an average federal prison. Because the federal government is so wasteful and inefficient, states are housing state prisoners for much less than that. The taxpayers of this nation should not be forced to spend $454 million to give the good life to former terrorists. They should be sent to the most unpleasant prison in the U.S., but this and other abuses of U.S. taxpayers will continue until we drastically downsize the federal government and greatly decrease its funding. Now we have a report that says this. At the beginning of 2015, the prison held 122 detainees. At the end of 2015, it held 107 detainees. Now we hear we're down to 80. And this report says, so over the course of 2015, the absolute minimum cost ranged between $3.7 million and $4.2 million per year for each detainee. I just had 43 students and teachers from Washburn High School, a very rural school in East Tennessee, and I told them I was coming to this hearing and how much it was costing per prisoner. And one of the young high school students says, "Can I get in?" I think it is really sad that we're spending this much money per prisoner when we could put them in a supermax prison for a tiny fraction of what we're spending. I think it's ridiculous, and I think any true fiscal conservative should be very, very upset about this. We need to drastically reduce the staff that's down there and come up with some other thing for these prisoners, because they don't deserve the good life that we're giving those prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commander Leipold, thank you for your service. I was in the CIA for a decade. I started in October of 2000. I was on the Yemen account. right before what happened with the coal, and spent some time in Arabia Felix on this issue. And thank you for what you've always done.
Thanks.
My first question is a simple question, Mr. Jocelyn. It's a related question about battlefield intelligence that we're gaining. We're in active conflicts all over the world. And, how are we, taking prisoners and having folks that you get on the battlefield and collecting battlefield intelligence is critical in protecting our forces. How is that happening now?
As far as I can tell, it is an ad hoc process at best, that a lot of battlefield intelligence is not being collected because we do not have a stable detention and interrogation program in place. Every expert I talk to from your corner of the world or previous corner of the world and elsewhere will tell you the value of human intelligence in terms of discerning what's actually going on and what our enemies are thinking. And I am concerned that we are not collecting enough of that intelligence currently.
Commander, do you have any opinions there?
I would agree absolutely on that point. The problem you have is when you don't use a place like Guantanamo Bay, where we are bringing truly the high level and the most dangerous terrorists that we want to capture. Today, we are taking the morally lazy way and we're using drone strikes. Every drone strike that we use is taking out a potential intelligence asset that perhaps we should go after and capture, because they truly are the ones that are going to tell us how the organization operates, how they conduct those operations, because it's only operationally when you understand how your enemy works that you can target them, you can disrupt them, and then eventually defeat them. And to not do that and to not leverage that intelligence is a disservice to the American people when we are a nation at war.
I appreciate that, Commander. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anybody here, if we close Guantanamo tomorrow and remove the detainees, either release them to other countries or bring them to the United States, is there anybody here that thinks that that would cause a drop in terrorist activity around the world? Mr. Jocelyn?
Absolutely not.
Commander?
No, sir.
Mr. Leota?
I'm not sure that we have enough evidence to be able to take a hypothetical question like that, Mr. Chairman, to be able to make a reasonable judgment, so I'd have to defer at this time.
Okay. Mr. Mora?
Sir, I think it would blunt the jihadist message about American injustice, and I think it would, it may, I can't be guaranteed, but I think it would reduce the appeal of the jihadist message to undecided populations in the Middle East and elsewhere. Also, I should say, it would comfort our allies in Europe who see Guantanamo as fundamentally an unjust detention facility.
So here, with how it would affect recruiting, I mean, here's why I've been skeptical that it would make it more difficult for them to recruit. I mean, take the 9/11 hijackers, 15 of them from Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, if a woman gets raped, she could end up getting stoned, and they're out there stoning a woman to death. And do you think, like, when they're done doing that, they're like, oh man, Guantanamo, just such a human rights violation? I mean, they're living in these areas where they're constantly abusing people's human rights. And so that's why I just don't think it's credible that it would change their ability to recruit, even though I know some people honestly feel that it would. I'm going to recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me drill down on that a little bit more. I have to say that there are some people who I respect very, very much in the military that have, decidedly strong opinions on this. One of them is our former National Security Advisor, General Jim Jones, and I got a quote here from him. He said, "America," and this is all, the Petraeus approach of winning hearts and minds, and General Odierno. Trying to get the Sunni awakening going. We were just, again, with a couple of Sunni sheikhs there about a month ago in Anbar province. And I think what Jim Jones explained, he said, America's greatest attribute in garnering support for our national security initiatives is our leadership and fidelity to our values and the principle of justice. He went on to say, it is my firm conviction that maintaining the facility at Guantanamo Bay indefinitely will have a lasting and deleterious impact on our standing in the world. Another gentleman who I respect greatly, General Martin Dempsey, he said that Guantanamo, quote, does does create a psychological scar on our national values. Whether it should or not, it does. And lastly, General Colin Powell, former Secretary of State under President Bush, has also remarked that, quote, Guantanamo has cost us a lot over the years in terms of our standing in the world and the way in which despots have hidden behind what we have done at Guantanamo. So, those are all men that I respect very much, and they're in the fight, and they have been for a long time. And Mr. Mora, how is maintaining the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, contrary to our basic values as Americans? Could you speak to that?
Mr. Ranking Member, if you look at political and human rights commentary all around the world, it's almost in every European country, every NATO country, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Guantanamo is identified as an injustice. I'll point you to one source. The very respected Inter-American Commission of Human Rights last year issued a volume entitled Closing Guantanamo. And in the first sentence of the first paragraph of the executive summary, it talks about the need to close Guantanamo because it's become a global symbol for injustice. Most of that is related to the, not only the fact that there were a number of individuals who were not jihadists who were sent to Guantanamo, although they've been since released and transferred out of the facility, but the military commissions has a large role to play in that. The fact that according to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and international lawyers in most other countries of the world, the military commissions lack credibility because they are subject to the discipline of the executive branch. They're not an independent judicial body, for example. But also, there's been interference with attorney-client privilege, and there's been withholding of evidence to defense counsel on some critical matters that might be relevant to the defense of their detainees. So all of these elements, historical and current, combine to reinforce a notion that rightfully or wrongfully has taken hold in the minds of many that Guantanamo is a symbol of injustice and contrary to human rights principles. I regret that it is so, but that's the fact, and we have to face the facts as they are.
Very good. I'll yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I just wonder, when you're talking about all this due process, everything, the military commissions aren't even enough. Well, guess what? We have guys in the field. They're fighting a war. They're not detectives. They're not going to be out there just collecting evidence and fingerprints. That will lead more of our soldiers and Marines to get killed, for sure. So I don't want to go down that road. These guys should not be treated like they are committing civilian crimes. They should be treated as if they're violating the laws of war. And when they're being captured in accordance with that, that should be the prism by which we see this. And I fear that going the other direction, where you somehow need to give them a quasi-civilian trial with basic constitutional rights almost, at the end of the day, in the normal battlefield, you are just not going to be able to do that without really diverting the mission. And I don't want to be doing that. So I appreciate the witnesses here today, and I appreciate your testimony, and I know this will be an issue that will continue to rear its head, and we will certainly be investigating any future detainees who are released and pose a danger to our country. This hearing is now adjourned.